We're on time. We've got an audience. We're at MAGFest. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Swords Against Darkness, an abridged history of sword and sorcery. And welcome to MAGFest 2025. I am your host, Sean C.W. Korsgaard. I am a U.S. Army veteran, an award-winning photojournalist, an author and editor who's worked with Baen Books, Writers of the Future, Analog Science Fiction and Fact, and I'm the editor of Anvil and Battleborn magazines, one of which you'll be hearing a bit more about at the end, I promise. And I have been an avid lover and fan, and as of recently, editor and author of Sword and Sorcery, since the time I picked up my first yellowed paperback in a used bookstore at the age of 13. You can still smell the print, and I love it. But we have an hour to discuss a genre with more than a century of history. I can't cover all of it in an hour. No one can. So like any good host, we are beginning where every fun panel should. Homework! These are some of the places you can read up a bit more about the history of the genre, some of its authors, its notable work, and the stories behind them, which I promise are as exciting, thrilling, and occasionally tragic as any story you will find on the shelves. These run from the history of Robert E. Howard and Blood and Thunder by the inestimable Mark Finn, the history of Weird Tales by both Stephen Jones and Jonathan Marbury, and please check out any of the following magazines: Tales of the Magician's Skull, Sursova, Weird Tales, Battleborn, New Edge Sword and Sorcery, for a taste of today's best and brightest in our bloodiest and most brilliant of fantasy genres. And naturally, please support your local library. So, let's start with a basic question for this. What is sword and sorcery? What makes it different from everything from epic fantasy to romantasy to portal fantasy? Sword and sorcery, or heroic fantasy, is a fantasy genre that was the dominant flavor, especially in American fantasy, for most of the 20th century, from roughly 1930 until 1990, and is currently seeing its brightest renaissance in years. Over the course of this panel, I hope we will cover some of its major authors, most significant works, and what makes a story sword and sorcery, and what has made it endure since the time it made its rousing and bloody debut in the pages of Weird Tales. According to author and editor Howard Andrew Jones, what separates sword and sorcery from other fantasy genres is a combination of 5 things. That is, the protagonist, the environment, obstacles they face, the action, and the writing style. And let's also take a moment each of these slides to admire some of the finest artwork in fantasy. Because if you're not a fan of Mr. Frank Frazetta, Ken Kelly, San Julian, don't worry, by the end you will be. If this doesn't make you want to pump iron or paint a panel van, I have failed you. First, the sword and sorcery protagonist. Unlike epic fantasy, you are typically focused on a single character or maybe a buddy cop style pair of characters. A single point of view, occasionally rotating, but again, there is a fixed point and it is a single character. That is why you have a series following Conan, Elric of Melniboné, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. You don't have the wide expansive casts that you do in Lord of the Rings or Wheel of Time. I say protagonist instead of hero for another reason, because many of these are not exactly heroic figures. Even the noblest among them are thieves, bandits, reavers, slayers, pirates. Occasionally outright villainous, if not outright anti-villains. They are underdogs and outsiders, often on the run or far from home, akin to the lone gunslingers of the American Western, or the Ronin of Japanese fiction. And unlike other fantasy genres, it's not uncommon for these characters to pass from author to author, as you see in comic books. Most famously with Conan. The people who have written Conan since Robert E. Howard died is almost a who's who of everybody in the history of fantasy. Everybody from Robert Jordan to Harry Turtledove to, we'll get to Conan in a minute. The environment of sword and sorcery. It takes place in lands and histories not too different from our own, where technologically is either commonly very primitive or fallen to a level of very primitive. Magic works, and almost never at the behest of our heroes. It is always very dangerous and very untrustworthy. Case in point, the surest sign that the sword and sorcery character you're reading is an anti-hero is that they can use magic. Typically, it is the tool of villains, monsters, wizards, and people that our hero is going to stab a sword through. And if our hero is going to use it, it's going to cost them dearly. The landscape is exotic, whether based on the far-flung histories of the ancient Bronze Age, or the fallen skyscrapers of a post-apocalyptic past, or the alien skies of a distant world. And they are always places of danger or decline, maybe the seedy underbelly of a large city of thieves, a dungeon where monsters dwell and treasure might lurk around every other corner, or an alien world beneath a dying star. Of course, action is fundamental for the genre. More than almost any other element, sword and sorcery has to nail the action. It has to have that punchy, authentic feeling of combat in its fight scenes, the kind that makes your average reader need a cigarette and a bourbon after every page. The very best of the genre should feel brutal, dangerous, and leave you feeling breathless. Epic fantasy and other genres may gloss over the action. I adore Tolkien, but he notably knocks out Bilbo right before 5 armies start to fight. Sword and sorcery, meanwhile, sticks you right on the front lines. You feel every swing of Conan's sword, the despair of Elric, the cost facing Hanuvar with every choice. It puts you into the fray, and man, do you feel it when done right. Then there are the obstacles. Typically, they face dangerous monsters, horrors beyond the comprehension of man, dark sorcery and the aim to earn riches, astonishing treasure, the love of a maiden or even a man in some cases, or even just the right to live another day and survive another feeling in the dangerous world they face. Environment plays a big role. There's primordial evils, often Lovecraftian horrors. One of the fun things about the genre is that, having come from the pages of Weird Tales, H.P. Lovecraft was friends with most of these authors. Although the approach is very different, as we'll get to when we talk to Robert E. Howard. There are dark gods with darker designs on man, treasures that are fleeting, and of course the burden of responsibility. Your hero may well win a crown for himself by the end, but it will carry itself very heavily on his head. And there is that horror influence. A lot of the authors we will cover came from the horror genre, or were friends with people within it, be it Stephen King or Lovecraft. Lastly, there is the writing style. A good sword and sorcery story has to have a very pulpy feeling to the prose. Again, this is a genre where every page should make you feel like you're watching an MMA cage fight, where the lyrics can be epic or grim, or epic fantasy should sing. Sword and sorcery should bleed off the page. And that's part of the reason it's proverbial kissing cousins with genres like the pulp detective, the western, the early vigilante thrillers, because they all came of age during that pulp era. This was the same era that gave us The Shadow, Superman, Batman, God, I can never remember his name, but any of the big pulp westerns that were big of that era. But speaking of that era, let's go all the way back to the beginning. You had adventure literature like H. Rider Haggard, Alan Quatermain, Rudyard Kipling, Lord Dunsany, Harold Lamb. These were the thrilling pulp stories of their era and the foundation of what would become sword and sorcery. But the biggest influence was a Mr. Edgar Rice Burroughs with his tales of a Confederate soldier warped to Mars where he found a princess, Martians to kill, and won himself a kingdom, Mr. John Carter. And of course, like I mentioned, this was the same era where you had the detective thrillers and superheroes coming of age, so that pulp sort of early 1930s G. Willikers feel, still evident today in the very best of sword and sorcery. But that takes us to Weird Tales. In the pages of this magazine, sword and sorcery became what it would become even to this very day. That first generation of authors cut their teeth on these pages. Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, C.L. Moore, Lynn Carter, L. Sprague de Camp, John Jakes, and Jack Vance all published some of their finest work here. Even the non-fantasy stories had that influence. Lovecraft, as I said, was a very big author in this circle, but your sword and sorcery authors don't tackle it the same way that Lovecraft did. There is a round-robin collection where they each tackle the same kind of story. A protagonist has their mind switched with an alien and finds themselves on an alien world. Lovecraft, true to form, has his protagonists go mad with the experience and break down sobbing. Howard, meanwhile, has him conquer the alien homeworld and decide he's going to lead them back to Earth so he can get his body back, damn it. Very different mindset there. Which brings us to our first highlighted author, the inestimable, the founding father, Robert E. Howard, Old Two-Gun Bob. He was a Texan pulp fiction author who was one of the most prolific authors of the past century. He dabbled in dozens of genres, epic poetry, westerns, boxing stories, sailing stories, and even invented several of them himself, including what we've become known as sword and sorcery. Had he not committed suicide at the age of 30, too damned young, he would have been America's answer to Tolkien, and those are the words of J.R.R. Tolkien, not my own. He is only now being considered one of the 20th century's most influential authors, and it took a long time for him to be considered more than just another pulp author, discounted by many of his people at the time. But the list of fantasy contributions he made are longer than my arm, but a few of my favorites. Solomon Kane, the Puritan fighter for justice. Bran MacMorn, King of the Picts. Call of Atlantis. El Borak, a Texan adventurer in the Middle East. Dark Agnes, one of the first female heroes in fantasy. And yes, Conan of Samaria, his magnum opus. Know, O prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath stars. Hither came Conan the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. That is the opening paragraph to the first Conan story, and you are hooked from there ever since, believe me. From his first appearance in Weird Tales, almost a century later right now, he has remained a fixture of the fantasy genre, oft copied, rarely equaled, completely unforgettable. Conan, notably, he's never referred to within Howard's lifetime as the Barbarian, is a hero of great mirth and terrible melancholies, brutal strength, and capable wit. For all the stereotypes of your barbarian hero, Robert E. Howard's Conan is a thinking man as much as he is capable of smashing his enemies to bits. Over the course of his adventures, we see him as a young thief, often outsmarted by his foes, all the way to when he's a troubled king, a kingdom won by his own hand and challenged by many people. Dozens of authors cut their teeth on Conan after Howard. Lynn Carter, L. Sprague de Camp, Michael Stackpole, Robert Jordan. And it's, to this day, probably America's greatest contribution to the fantasy genre, because he is the quintessential American hero. Notably, the most notable detail, unlike Aragorn or other epic fantasy characters, he is not a king given by birthright or blood, that he wins his by sword. But if you've never read a Conan story, start with the Tower of the Elephant. It is from whence that paragraph I read came from, and it follows young Conan on, well, you quickly see where it's been copied, imitated, referenced throughout every major work of fantasy of the last century. It opens in a tavern where Conan makes a boast that he can't quite match. It breaks into a wizard's tower where, rather than the treasure he is promised, because this is the pulp era where sci-fi and fantasy blend together, he encounters a space alien. Being held hostage by the wizard for his power, begging for death, and Conan grants it. And as the wizard wakes, the alien takes him into the jewel as its tower begins to collapse, and Conan escapes, poorer than he began, losing his sword in the process. But it ends with him looking up at the stars, his view of the universe completely changed, and wondering just where the hell he's going to go next. If you've never read anything by Robert Howard, please start there. But Howard was not the only author of that generation you should check out. For those of you who like your thieves, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber are the quintessential fantasy thieves. They gave us the city of Lankhmar, this dirty, large underbelly of a city, where even the city itself makes our average fantasy thieves guild look like consummate professionals. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser themselves are fascinating characters. One is a lanky but intelligent thief, the other is a muscular barbarian, and the two of them make a very interesting pair between the two. Their adventures are often surreal, featuring twist endings. Their first adventure together, the treasure they hope to seek, turns out to be the brain of the giant monster that the dungeon they're in actually happens to be. Jirel of Jory, with the Black God's Kiss, gave us one of our first female protagonists to really make waves in the genre, and the first female author. Notably, C.L. Moore was well known as a female author to the entire Weird Tales circle, except for the man who she eventually married, Harry Kuttner, who wrote his first letter to her to Mr. C.L. Moore. But by all accounts, they had a lovely, happy marriage. But her fantasy is sensual in a way that few authors of the time period in any genre were. And of course, we get our red-haired sword woman archetype from her work. The Dying Earth of Jack Vance. From anyone who's played D&D, this is where you get the magic system. And I encourage you to start with Leanne the Wayfarer. It is a 2,800-word short story, free to read on the internet. You have time to do that while you're in line this weekend. And you will actually encounter one of the first bosses of D&D, Chun the Unavoidable. As I told the D&D panel last year, if you encounter him in your adventures, and you haven't read this story, I'll tell you this bit for free. Run. In fact, stab one of your friends, leave them, and then run. He is called Chun the Unavoidable for a reason. Other notable authors of the Golden Age. You have Clark Ashton Smith, who threaded the needle of Lovecraftian horror and Howardian adventure like few ever did. Lynn Carter, who would take up Howard's mantle in many ways. Kuttner, whose Elac of Atlantis stories had very strange and surreal settings. Lee Brackett, who was the godmother of Sword and Planet. You folks might remember her from a little script she wrote called The Empire Strikes Back. John Jakes, who most people know for his Civil War fiction, was younger than I was when he wrote Sword and Sorcery. Manly Wade Wellman, which, as you'd expect from a name like that, wrote really machismo, like his birth name is Manly. Had great parents there. But he wrote John the Balladeer, an Appalachian hero who, with a silver string guitar and a six-shooter at his side, fights demons in Appalachia. And of course, Paul Anderson, whose Scandinavian influence Three Hearts and Three Lions and The Broken Sword, as well as The High Crusade, which we'll talk about on Sunday. But one of those, The Broken Sword, is important because it introduced the alignment system as we know it. Order and chaos. But it would take another author to take that and run with it to the hills. Which brings us to the Silver Age of Sword and Sorcery. As the older works began to have more and more reprints, you got your second generation of Sword and Sorcery authors, penned by an odd and interesting, colorful mix of angry hippies and angrier Vietnam veterans. There was a much darker, more experimental, and boundary-pushing edge to Sword and Sorcery this time. It's arguably also the most commercially successful era for the genre, as we will get to a bit when we start talking about crossovers, but this was the genre at its most boundary-pushing and culturally dominant. And a big part of that was this man here, Michael Moorcock, still with us at the age of 85, still writing, and still as ornery as ever. For those of you who are unfamiliar with him, he made his name writing essays in the 50s, where he blasted Tolkien as the author of Epic Pooh, Robert A. Heinlein as a fascist wanker. And yet, he was the first vocal defender of Robert E. Howard and early Sword and Sorcery. Although that didn't keep him from wanting to put his own twist on the genre, which he did through what became known as the Eternal Champion cycle. Now, for those of you who have gotten tired of bad superhero movies and worse multiverse movies, Michael Moorcock is who you thank and or blame for that, because the Eternal Champion was the first multiverse, originally conceived as a way to link up all of his various settings. But the Eternal Champion is, depending on which world you're on, whoever is meant to save or doom the world through their actions. Dorian Hawkmoon, Corum, Jirel Irse, Erkos, and of course, probably the most influential hero or villain, depending on who you ask of the era, Elric of Melniboné. But in the process, he contributed things like the balance of order and chaos, dark gods, and, well, let's just meet Mr. Elric. Now, how many of you played Castlevania or Final Fantasy? You might recognize some of those book covers I'm citing, because the author would later go on to do work on Castlevania and Final Fantasy. I have brought evil to many places, but usually there has already been evil to match mine. I seek no excuses, for I know what I am, and I know what I have done. I have slain malignant sorcerers and destroyed oppressors, but I have also been responsible for slaying fine men, and a woman, my cousin, whom I loved, I killed, or my sword did. Elric of Melniboné was something brand new to the genre, where before you had muscular heroes, or at least lithe cat-like heroes, Elric is a sickly albino, only kept alive through a combination of dark magic, potions, and a sentient sword by the name of Stormbringer that consumes the souls of his enemies, or if one isn't handy, his friends. He begins his cycle as the emperor of a dark, decadent, falling empire called Melniboné, and ends it in a mercenary in a losing battle against the forces of chaos, rebelling against his fate. Very different from the other stories of his era for just how dark some of the places Elric goes was. He actually dies in one of the first stories we're introduced to him, which means every Elric story after that was written between then. But again, this is why he had to invent a multiverse. And the number of moody albino anti-heroes he inspired are beyond number. Dristo Erden, Raistlin Majer, Geralt of Rivia, Arthas from Warcraft, Griffith from Berserk. For our Berserk fans, you'll notice that our hero/villain are basically Conan and Elric. For an introduction to these stories, I recommend While the Gods Laugh, a short story that has Elric meet one of his longtime companions, the bard Moonglum, and also introduces you to the battle between order and chaos within the world. And also you get to see just how moody Elric is and how traitorous Stormbringer can be. But we also have people who make Elric look like a saint, such as Kane by Karl Edward Wagner. Kane is very much the kind of person Conan would have killed in one of his stories. He is ageless, immortal, dabbles in dark magic, and cruel beyond measure. Yet what makes Kane an interesting protagonist is twofold. One, he is perhaps the best portrayal of an immortal character in all of fantasy, putting every vampire to shame. And that he constantly finds people more evil than him, and battles over what is left of his soul. Two Sun Setting sees him team up with a giant to delve into the depths of the earth and fight primordial forces. David Drake, a Vietnam veteran who cut his teeth writing fantasy that was very much influenced by better days, the height of the Roman Empire, the glory of the Viking Age. In fact, the Barrow Troll is sort of his retelling of Beowulf. Very interesting, and few authors ever match David Drake's gift for action. So please, give him a check. And then there is Imaro by Charles Saunders, who was the first notable African-American author in the genre. He is the godfather of a subgenre within the sword and sorcery subgenre, known as Sword and Soul. His hero is, and the world it's based on, is very heavily influenced by African mythology and African mythos, such as the giant hippo man you see Imaro wrestling on the cover there. Notable other authors for the era include Niftaleen by Michael Shea, which was the last notable sword and sorcery author to win the World Fantasy Award. It features a hero who is an unreliable narrator who is repeatedly sent on, well, his most notable adventure sends him into hell, to give you an idea of just how dark that one gets, but few books are ever as beautifully written as Michael Shea's. Roger Zelazny's Dilvish the Damned and Chronicles of Hanuvar, Andre Norton's Witch World. For those of you broken-hearted by what happened with a certain Neil Gaiman, give Tanith Lee a try. Most of what he ripped off for Sandman came from her. David Gimmel's Legend, which is punchy and brutal in a way that few other authors in genre are. And Jessica Amanda Salmonson, who, for the time, was very influential for the fact she wrote very Japanese-influenced fiction, and is today looked back on as one of the first trans authors in the genre. But when I mention that cultural height, here's where Sword and Sorcery really found its stunning successes. Because it didn't just have great authors going in new directions. You saw it break out into comic books and bring in a whole new generation of readers. It began with a Conan the Barbarian comic at Marvel Comics, thanks to Roy Thomas. And Sword and Sorcery became a fundamental part of the comic scene and wouldn't really end until the 1990s during the comic crash. Many of Sword and Sorcery's most famous characters got long-running series in this era, Conan being the most notable. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser got a series from DC, actually appearing in an issue of Wonder Woman at one point. And the only time you've ever seen Elric and Conan meet each other canonically happened in a comic book. And of course, this is when it started going around the world. This is where Japan gets everything from Berserk to Goblin Slayer. And I think part of the reason it took off so well in comics is that, again, think back to what makes a story Sword and Sorcery. Pulpy prose, shorter stories, serialized fiction, repeated characters, that more than one author can write it. This lends itself very well to comics or manga, in a way that epic fantasy never really has. Case in point, there have been multiple attempts to adapt Wheel of Time or A Song of Fire and Ice, in Song of Ice and Fire. What do I care? George R. R. Martin's never finishing it. And they never get past the first or second book. Meanwhile, Conan is on something like his 6th fantasy series. Tower of the Elephant, the story I tell you, usually only takes a single issue. And they were the beating heart of a thriving fantasy scene within American comics that only really stopped in the 1990s during the speculator crash. Today, we actually are seeing something of a revival, largely at Titan Comics, where they have for those of you who want to give Elric a try, the best-looking adaptation of Elric of Melniboné in comic form. And their ongoing Conan the Barbarian by Jim Zub and the Savage Sword revival, I think, best thing on the local comic shop today. So please, if you like comic books, start there. And then, of course, we have music, where aside from Tolkien and maybe Lovecraft, no works of fantasy have inspired more modern music than Sword and Sorcery, including being one of the formative influences on multiple heavy metal bands, the entire power metal subgenre. And it probably helps that a lot of the same folks who did book covers for fantasy novels in this era did album covers. It probably also helps that some of these authors were songwriters. Michael Moorcock actually toured with the Blue Oyster Cult for a time. And for those of you who want an idea of what you should be listening to, tried to keep this kid-friendly as much as I can for a Blood and Guts panel. I tried to pull a variety of songs here. Different subgenres, everything from 70s acid rock to modern power metal, from all around the world, from British bands in the 70s, American bands in the 80s, to actually one Japanese band today. Power metal, acid rock, everything. But if you want to have music that captures the spirit, start here and your Spotify playlist will do the rest. And of course, you had film. Until The Lord of the Rings came along, a little over 20 years later, Sword and Sorcery was the definitive look of fantasy and fiction. A large part of that was the success of Conan the Barbarian. Another part of that was the various things that came out of Conan. For example, who here has ever watched He-Man and the Masters of the Universe? Now, how many of you also knew that it was supposed to be a Conan the Barbarian cartoon tying into the movie? We had like 50 hands before, now we have 1. So, 2. Thoth-Amon, who was the original villain, yes. So, yes, there is a kid-friendly version of Conan if you just shave the file off a little. Who am I kidding? I read Tower of the Elephant to my infant. It's all kid-friendly. But it inspired a boom of films like Dragon Slayer, Fire and Ice, and of course, Heavy Metal Magazine and the Heavy Metal Movie. But we gotta talk about Conan the Barbarian. This is perhaps the greatest movie, pre-Lord of the Rings, for the fantasy genre. One that is, while hideously unfaithful to Robert E. Howard, please understand, it is not a faithful adaptation of any Conan story. Do not take it as such. But my God, is it a chest-thumping, blood-pumping, gloriously cheesy machismo wonderfully fun sword and sorcery film. It has a star-making career turn from Arnold Schwarzenegger, James Earl Jones, and Mako hamming it up as thespians can only do. Some of those brutal action scenes ever filmed. Although it only held the crown for 2 years before the director, John Milius, made Red Dawn, and then killed 100 more people on screen than he did here. It has one of the greatest film scores ever composed. While you're looking for heavy metal, please look up the Basil Polidorus score from this movie as well. And it's beautifully shot to the point it's almost operatic. Next time you watch this movie, and it is streaming on Prime and Peacock at the moment, so no excuses, you can watch it for free, try to mute the dialogue and just listen to the music and watch the gestures and movements of the characters, and you can still get every plot beat and motivation. The benefit to casting a bodybuilder in the lead role is he can do a lot without talking, which, given this is Schwarzenegger in 1982, that's probably a good thing. But please, seek it out and for yourself, solve the riddle of steel. And then there's gaming. For those of you who didn't see my panel last year on the history of Dungeons & Dragons, it's on YouTube if you want to. Sword and Sorcery was the beating heart of early first and second generations Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax considered it so essential, he included a reading list in the player's guide called Appendix N, which actually makes a very fun reading list for those of you who don't want to use mine. But several of the early modules were straight-out adaptations of Conan or Fafhrd the Grey Mouser stories, or if you were really unlucky and had a real dick for a DM, Chun the Unavoidable from Jack Vance. And many fantasy video games, even JRPGs to this day, have that influence again: quest-based, hero-driven, character-focused, not a large cast. It lends itself well to gaming. I actually wager many of the modern struggles of D&D come from the fact that you could tackle something like Tower of the Elephant in a single session. Try to tackle Lord of the Rings, and half of you have jobs, the other half have kids, and you might not even make it to Rivendell. And who the hell wants to play the prom game they have planned at the moment? Unless it has stabbing. If it's violent prom, maybe. But moving on, though. So you have a genre. Yes, the only good use for a panel van. Let's just take that in for a moment. This is the peak of sword and sorcery. It parties with rock stars, makes movie careers and film. The authors are at the very peak of the genre. You can find these in every corner store in America. It makes the panel van something for more than that creepy guy who hangs around schoolyards. So where does it all go wrong? And how did it all go wrong at once? I find a visual demonstration may help. These are sword and sorcery paperbacks of the era. Cheap, thin, and to give you a point of how they made sure these were profitable, this Michael Moorcock has an ad for Newport cigarettes in it. This Conan the Barbarian, meanwhile, to give you an idea of what you're missing, has a poster. This is the first 4 Michael Moorcock books of Elric collected in one cycle. This is every single Conan story ever written by Robert E. Howard in a single volume. And this is a single volume of The Wheel of Time. As you can see, there is a slightly different approach to the genre. There are 14 of these, and Brandon Sanderson made his twice as big. All of Conan, one Wheel of Time. And what's especially interesting about that is Robert Jordan was, for most of the 80s, the author on Conan the Barbarian. He was the champion of sword and sorcery for that era, viewed as one of its bright future prospects. So him being the founder of modern doorstopper fantasy, for our sports fans in the room, is like if Michael Jordan retired to play baseball and then turned out to be the best player since Babe Ruth. So you can pin down the exact date the crown was lost to epic fantasy, January 15th, 1990, with the publishing of Eye of the World. You can then track several other things. 1991, 3 guys from Seattle drop a little single by the name of Smells Like Teen Spirit, and grunge kicks the crap out of hair metal, and you never hear from it again in America for the most part. Thank God Europe carried on the tradition, all I'm saying. A lot of the old authors, Paul Anderson, C.L. Moore, Lynn Carter, died of old age. Some of the new ones, like Karl Edward Wagner, died far too young, as an alcoholic in his 40s. Others, like David Drake, shifted genres. Drake became a military science fiction author. And sales dried up overnight. Again, I've worked in publishing, and I've spoken to editors at the time, and the looks in their eyes when they talk about what happened to Sword and Sorcery, you usually only see at the American Legion from guys who are at Fallujah. So epic fantasy takes the crown for the next 30 years, and then it stumbled. Again, I've worked in the industry, I've seen the sales numbers, and over the 2010s, you can actually track the decline of fantasy as a genre commercially because of 2 guys who won't write a book and will never write another book. You can actually pin the date where they entered terminal decline. The week of May 19th, 2019 was the peak of sales for doorstopper fantasy. How many of you watched season 8 of Game of Thrones? And that is why George R.R. Martin is never writing another book. So you have the 2 most high-profile works of epic fantasy burning out into incompletion. The crown is up for grabs. And luckily for us, after decades of darkness, a new age for sword and sorcery has begun. Thanks to independent publishing, you have a whole host of new authors and magazines, many of them self-published or small press, doing bold, exciting things, pushing in new directions, often opposing directions. To give you an example, New Edge Sword and Sorcery and Cersova magazine could not be more different in how they approach the genre. And yet they both have their place. Both have some fantastic authors and great characters, and are must-reads if you love the genre. Tales of the Magician's Skull is probably the best pulp magazine since the original Weird Tales. Hell, Weird Tales is revived. But the key figure to much of this is an author by the name of Howard Andrew Jones. Show of hands, who's heard of him? You will by the end of this. You will. He was a champion of the genre from the early 2000s. Harold Lamb, his work is today collected and available to the public because he took all of his stories that were rotting away in a garage and transcribed them by hand so that future generations could enjoy them. He was a champion of classical authors like Michael Shea, David Drake, Lee Brackett. My God, the way Howard talked about Lee Brackett would make you think George Lucas wasn't the heart of Star Wars. I mean, he wasn't. Lee Brackett saved that second movie. Moving on. He was the editor of Tales of the Magician's Skull, and his Chronicles of Hanuvar threaded the needle between classical and modern sword and sorcery in a way that no other work can. It's the blueprint I think all sword and sorcery work will in the future follow. And after 20 years of hard work, writing his own fiction, proving mentor to dozens of other authors, working behind the scenes, he was diagnosed with brain cancer last September. And last Thursday, 1 week ago today, he died. Books could be written about the impact he had. Books shall be written about the impact he had. But for now, let me introduce you to Hanuvar. I'm not overselling it. It's the best fantasy series of the decade. 3 books, you owe it to yourself to check it out. But just in case you're on that fence, let me ham it up one last time. The city of Valanis has fallen. Its people have been carried off into slavery. Its temples burned, its treasures plundered, its fields salted. The Dervan Empire, its hated foe, stands victorious, and in fact, their victory is complete in every way save one, that Hanuvar, last and greatest general of Valanis, still lives, his heart set upon a single goal. Against the might of a vast empire, he has only an aging sword arm, a lifetime of hard-won wisdom, and the greatest military mind in all the world, set upon that goal, that no matter where the empire has taken his people, he will find them, He will free them, and he will lead them to a new home. No matter what it costs, no matter what dark forces oppose them, they will be free. It is a retelling of the Punic Wars, with a thinly veiled Hannibal as the hero. That's wildly unique. Hanuvar is a hero of mighty fury, but also great compassion. Middle-aged compared to most sword and sorcery protagonists, so he has to outwit people as often as he outfights them. And that he is fighting to free a people from bondage, not for treasure, not for glory, but to save his people from extinction. It's a beautifully written, haunting story, and if you take nothing else from me today, please buy these books. But Howard is not alone. You have Larry Correia, who published a series called The Saga of the Forgotten Warrior, this heavily Indian-influenced, very blood-drunk series that has some of the best action scenes I think have been put to page in the past decade. And just to show you just what kind of aggressive attitude Larry takes to these books, this is the dedication page for the final book in the series, out next month. By God, here comes Larry Correia with the steel chair! Bam! Sword and sorcery, because some genres actually finish their fucking books. The best Conan stories since Robert E. Howard are written by a man named John C. Hawking. For years, one of those Conan paperbacks that you couldn't get a hold of was Conan and the Emerald Lotus. Now it's in beautiful hardcover, along with Conan and the City of the Dead. Beautiful, gut-wrenching stories by one of fantasy's best. Jonathan Mayberry, another one of those horror authors, just finished a trilogy that's very heavily influenced by his own experience as a horror author and the work of Michael Moorcock. And again, you have any number of modern authors that are doing brilliant work. C.L. Werner is publishing a brutal Japanese-influenced fantasy setting following a fellow by the name of Shintaro Oba, the Demon Slayer. Nathan Long is the second author to ever write in Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and he is every bit the equal of Fritz Leiber. Milton Davis, in addition to being one of the hardest working men in independent publishing, publishes a very proudly African-American influenced fantasy setting following a fellow named Changa as he journeys throughout the Indian Ocean. So vivid, you can smell the trade winds. Scott Oden, brutal fantasy following an orc protagonist. Skylar Hernstrom, probably Canada's best living fantasy author, in my view. Adrian Cole, who's been working at this since the 70s, and still reads like something from the 70s at its very acid-trippy best. Christopher Rocchio, maybe the best living space opera author on the planet today, is starting to dabble in the genre. Jim Zub with his comics. You have so many great authors today. If only there was one place you could find them all. By the way, I have a magazine. It's called Battleborn. You should check it out. That QR code actually takes you to our mailing list, and we will send you $200 worth of ebooks if you subscribe in the next week. That's one way to make sure we make our Kickstarter. Battleborn. Buy it now from the front lines of fantasy. So, is sword and sorcery the fantasy of the future, the once and future king of the genre? Why do I think it's going to take the crown once more? For starters, damn near every series I just named is either complete or doesn't end on a cliffhanger. The day of doorstopper fantasy where people trust an author to finish their series is tragically done. Martin and Rothfuss ruined that for everybody. I've worked in trad publishing. There aren't a whole lot of people getting a chance to publish a never-ending series anymore. So you need to have a series that is reliable, complete, and delivers everything in a single book. Ideally, multiple of these authors can turn in multiple stories a year. Larry turns in 3 a year. Howard, before he died, wrote 3 Hanuvar novels in 2 years. So you have speed, efficiency, and yet don't sacrifice any of that quality. The big success these days is romantasy or cozy fantasy, and I have nothing against those genres. But when I read a fantasy novel, I want people to slay a dragon, not sleep with it. And I suspect a lot of people are like that, where they may want something cozy, but there are still people who want that machismo, that heroic and action-filled fantasy. And Sword and Sorcery has always been your best hit for that. And, as I said, in addition to all of those great new authors taking things in new directions, how many of you know what the public domain is? Remember all those golden age science fiction authors and fantasy authors from that first act? Most of them are going to be in the public domain in the next 10 years. Anyone will be able to write a Conan story by the middle of the 2030s. And not just stories. We'll be able to see music, movies, short films, video games, for crying out loud. I mean, we're at MAGFest, for crying out loud. Some of these designers could do some crazy stuff with some of this stuff, I'm sure. So we are going to see a renaissance in some of those classical works the way we have for Lovecraft or Sherlock Holmes, I'm sure. But if I'm truly honest, I think it's something more primal than that. Sword and Sorcery taps into something universal. From our earliest civilizations, humanity has a fixation on stories about heroes. Yes, violence, but also glory. Why would the future be any different? Our oldest stories are a reflection of this. The oldest known work of fiction follows a fellow by the name of Gilgamesh, who slays a monster with his best friend, seeking immortality, and only finds it knowing that his story will be told. We speak English, a language whose oldest survival work follows a guy who kills a monster, that monster's mother, and a dragon in a quest for immortality and glory by the name of Beowulf. Stories about heroes are fundamentally human, the beating heart of so many of our cultures. Heroism and valor are in every culture virtues, and it's at the beating heart of Sword and Sorcery. That hunger for glory, that worship of heroes, that seeking of thrills, that is why we have fantasy. We have always told stories about heroes, real and fictional. Be they Horatius at the Bridge, Gilgamesh, Conan, Audie Murphy, Hanuvar, even Elric or Kane. We find these aspirational. These are the stories that make us want to sing songs, play video games, paint them on the side of a panel van for all the world to see. It's something primal and perhaps our fondest wish. To look up at the stars with wonder, seek our place in the world, that hunger for power and glory and adventure, and to come together to share stories about heroes who found them, to slay the dragon, save the village, and become a king by your own hand. That's fundamental to humanity and Sword and Sorcery. Now, for those of you who want to see my work elsewhere, I'm actually in a magazine that came out this month called Anvil. That story in the magazine I have, free to read. So for those of you who want some reading material this weekend, click away. Now remember, that Battleborn magazine mailing list, $150 to $200 of free fiction if you signed up by the end of the week. So please, make me have to work for it. And if you haven't gotten tired of looking at my ugly Meg and hear me gab about fantasy, you can follow me at social, pretty much SCW Korsgaard anywhere. You can find my first 2 anthologies, Worlds Long Lost and They're Here, everywhere fine books are sold. And please stay in touch over the next year, because I'm not only launching a fantasy magazine, I'm putting together 2 fantasy anthologies as a tribute to Howard Andrew Jones, and a Sword and Sorcery textbook that'll collect the very best of the genre, so that the next time I give a panel like this and you ask, where should I look? At this book I will be holding in my hands. But if you've loved any of the works I've told you about today, seek them out, buy them, go to your library and tell them to buy them. If you love this panel, let our fine MAGFest volunteers know. And I hope to see you out there, sword in hand, good book in your hearts, and a song in your head. Until then, swords together, everyone. Thank you. Now, we have the room for another 10 minutes. If you have any questions, I am at your disposal. And if not, oh, yes, we do.
Have you seen a show called Primal?
I adore it. Absolutely adore it.
Excellent. And then second question, I'm new to John Carter and Solomon Kane. I hate both of those movies. What are your thoughts on those?
The Solomon Kane movie is a very interesting prequel that doesn't get to the good stuff. The John Carter movie, still a lot of fun, but nothing beats the book on either count, especially because in John Carter's case, it's public domain, and in Solomon Kane's case, it's Robert E. Howard. I think he should be a central reading for everyone just for the fact that few people have ever managed to pack as much action, power, and fury into a short story as he has. Give him a try if you haven't. Yes, sir. I do think it is a fundamentally American genre, and I touch on that very briefly, in that you have that pulp fiction roots that was uniquely American. It developed alongside the comic book, the Western, the pulp detective. And even though you've seen other authors and other cultures do wild things with it, Michael Moorcock's British, Kentaro Miura's Japanese, some of the best media today is anime in genre. It is still fundamentally American. Look at the heroes, for example. There are very few fated kings in American fiction. A lot of people who stare down monarchies or evil villains. I mean, one of the most fundamentally American stories is a retelling of Faust, where an American presidential candidate argues for the soul of someone who sold his soul to the devil and won. Hell, we have a song about a hillbilly who beats the devil in a fiddle playing contest. So defiance and authority is a fundamental American value that is featured in so much of our fiction, and it's a beating heart of sword and sorcery. That's why so many of the characters are rebels, outcasts, people on the outside of society who fight their way in and occasionally change it, or die trying, gloriously as the case may be. Anything else? Yes. Okay, so that's a hard question because, yes, that's a hard question. A lot of those games, there are sword and sorcery elements. For example, any given quest could be a sword and sorcery short story. But the fact that, especially with games from Software, much of the world it's grimdark fantasy with the spirit of sword and sorcery for its action, I would say. It kicks my ass, and I love it for it. Yes, I am. Good man. Anyone else? Then all I'll say is thank you for joining me this Thursday night. I hope you learned a lot, came away with a few favorites, and enjoy the hell out of your MAGFest.